Welcome to Duke Reads. I'm Frank Stasio, the host of The State of Things on North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC. Tonight we're going to talk with Tom Katsouleas, the Dean of Duke's Pratt School of Engineering, a professor of electrical and computer engineering. And the book he's chosen is Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. Jared Diamond, the author. Tom's been at Duke and Dean of the Pratt School since 2008. He earned a PhD in physics and a BS in physics both at UCLA in 1979 and 1984, respectively. He continued there as a faculty member for 7 years. His primary research interest is the use of plasmas as novel particle accelerators and light sources. He joined the University of Southern California faculty as an associate professor of electrical engineering in 1991. He rose steadily through the academic ranks, becoming a full professor in 1997. There he also served as an Associate Dean of Engineering and Vice Provost of Information Technology Services, and he serves as an Associate Editor of the IEEE Transactions on Plasma Science and the Journal of Plasma Physics and Controlled Fusion. Tom says he selected Collapse to discuss because, quote, I enjoyed the way Jared Diamond frames key questions about our history and our future around the simple questions that he explores, the possible future of our society, humankind, and the planet by looking at several examples of isolated societies that have flourished or disappeared, from Eastern Islanders to the Vikings in Greenland to the great Mayan culture in South America and the small society in Pitcairn Islands. So let's get on with the discussion now and talk about these questions that we have today as our kind of study questions for the book club, but also, as always, happy to entertain your questions as our conversation continues. Tom, first of all, pleasure to talk with you.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's very nice to meet you, Frank.
It's good to meet you. Great book, great choice. Talk a little bit more about your reasons for this book and the way you think Diamond kind of frames really the question of the century for us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big Jared Diamond fan. You know, I devoured Guns, Germs, and Steel when it came out and jumped on Collapse when it came out. He is a great synthesizer and asks these really deep and profound questions, but he frames them in very simple and approachable ways. And for example, in Guns, Germs, and Steel, he really motivated the whole book around trying to answer the question from his Aboriginal friend, why does the white man have more cargo than we do? Cargo meaning material goods. And so really this whole book that he wrote about the history of humanity came about trying to answer his Aboriginal friend. And it had to do with, you know, the size of wild grain in Mesopotamia and the orientation of the continents being, you know, north, south in Africa and east, west in Europe and Asia. So really deep insights that required him to bring together his expertise in evolutionary biology, but also archaeology, linguistics, and anthropology, and so on. And I find that exciting, his ability to do that kind of interdisciplinary scholarship.
Yeah, they're deep questions and they're important questions, and so he immediately moves you off whatever polarity you had. Either we're all doomed because, you know, human beings are stupid and always overused, or don't worry about it, technology will resolve this whole thing. And yet, even though he takes you deeper and shows you that it's a more complex question, the examples he uses really make it very clear that these are the kinds of choices we have.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and he actually uses that in the title of the book, why societies choose to fail or succeed. And I think that's the neat thing that you get from the book, is that it's neither predetermined that we will collapse, nor is it guaranteed we're going to survive. And it really, he kind of shows you, you know, how the options are up to us as a society and what's important in making those choices. So that's exciting. Now, with regard to the book Collapse, again, I don't think he framed it that way, but I see this whole book as being about one question that an undergraduate at UCLA asked him, which is basically what was going through the mind of the Easter Islander who cut down the last palm tree that would essentially seal their doom, because then they lost the ability to build canoes and do offshore fishing, and eventually starve to death when there was a slight change in the climate. So you know, it's that question that sort of drove the rest of the book, I think.
Well, let's take that. That's the second question on our list, but certainly we're right here now. Let's look at that particular question and talk more about it. I mean, first of all, let's imagine what was going on when you see that last palm tree come down.
Yeah, well, you know, it probably wasn't even coming down. It was probably just coming up. It was probably very small and not very important by that point in time. What happened over time is, so the Easter Islanders populated one of the most remote parts of the world, beginning about 900 AD and lasted for several hundred years, 400, 500, close to 1600. They grew over that time, and then towards the end, the last 100 years or so, they began to do self-inflicted environmental damage, and they started cutting down trees in order to plant crops. And what happened over time is that the trees became less and less important to their economy. They shifted to farming, they shifted to local fishing, and that was basically what was sustaining them. So gradually over time, they became deforested. One of the consequences of that, and this is a theme throughout the other societies, including Greenland and the Anasazi in the Southwest and the Mayans in the Yucatan, was that you cut down the trees, then there's wind and rain tends to cause the soil erosion, and then the land becomes less productive and living becomes more marginal. And so that's what happened with the Easter Islanders too. But by the time the last palm tree was cut down, it was no longer an important part of the economy.
And that's an interesting point, because when you compare that to the folks who lived in Papua New Guinea, they were conserving their trees. But it was clear that they understood the value of those trees for farming.
Right. Right. And yeah, similarly, there's several examples in Tikopia, another Polynesian island, where people avoided the tendency to do the tragedy of the commons. It's better for me to cut down this tree, even though I realize it's bad for everyone else. I think the problem in the differentiator between Papua New Guinea and Easter Island is that the Easter Islanders may not have realized. In some cases, societies are aware of the damage they're causing, and through things like either rational behavior, like tragedy of the commons, where it's to the interest of the individual sheep herder to overgraze, or through irrational behavior of we just can't seem to change what we've always done, they do it anyway. And I think in the Easter Islander case, I suspect they didn't really know. And didn't appreciate the importance.
Well, and you wonder if, and of course, when you read a book like this, you're always looking for that essential human quality.
Yes.
What is it that's in all of us that would have driven us to do the same thing if the circumstances had been different? And when you get back to Papua New Guinea, again, the relationship, when I see that as the trees fall, my productivity goes down, I'm immediately affected by the loss of trees. The trees on Easter Island, as you said, weren't part of the economy. And, as long as there are 100 trees left, you can still do deep water fishing. If there's one tree, if there's one canoe on the ground, you can still do deep water fishing. And it's only when that last canoe goes that you realize, oh, we shouldn't have cut down the trees.
Yep, I think that's right. And the other piece of it is the time frame. So it took about 100 years for the trees to disappear completely from Easter Island. It's completely deforested after that, and it's still deforested to this day. And so there's this effect of normalcy creep. It just seemed normal. You don't really notice the change happening. And of course, that's a metaphor for things that we experience in life today. And there's lots of examples of that. And there are differences in Papua New Guinea as one, in Tokugawa, Japan is another, where the deforestation was taking place in the 1700s in Japan at a rate fast enough that they did notice it. And they were able to do calculations and estimate that on the course they were on, they would be deforested. And so essentially that was the beginning of science of forestry. And they were able to apply science to change their course. And so that's a key difference in what allowed them to, similar in Papua New Guinea, they could see the effect immediately and could change their course.
But it also brings up the question of how you administer that change or how you authorize the change. The fascinating, I think, dichotomy he poses between the top-down kind of management and the bottom-up.
Yep.
And in a place like Japan, where it comes from the top, it worked.
Yeah, so in Japan, you had the shoguns who were absolutely powerful, and they could dictate, we will not cut down these trees. And it sort of helped that the people most affected by this were as much as anything else, the boating industry. But the Japanese leadership at that time was very isolationist, so they were perfectly happy not to have more boats anyway for other reasons. So it was an easy decision for them to make. But Diamond points out there are other examples, New Guinea and Tikopia, where it's bottom up. But there are a lot of things that have to be in place for the bottom up to work. And you probably know from your own life how difficult it is to get agreement on something like that. But it requires that there be great homogeneity among the people and clear understanding. It has to be very clear what the consequences of the group behavior would be. And so it really involves a certain amount of enlightenment that's not common, but it can't happen.
Well, again, it's that and scale too. I think the idea of it being very small makes it work, because first of all, there aren't as many people at the meeting. That's the first thing. But that they all experience things mostly in the same way. If we're all farmers, soil erosion is going to be an issue for each and every one of us.
Right.
In the question, when it works for an elite, when there's an elite group from ordering things from the top down, it seemed to me that that ideas of conservation work well when that also sort of fits the needs of the elite. But we saw in the example of Montana, maybe we can skip to that idea, where there are competing interests, and maybe one group would like to see us mine until we drop, and suddenly another group is no longer the beneficiary if the mining jobs aren't there anymore, and that's when the equation changes.
So one of the recurring themes is the importance of leadership and leadership decisions, and so what motivates the leaders is obviously of key importance. And in Easter Island, it was there were 12 rival clans, and the clan leaders were competing with each other to build the largest statues, the moai, and they were more interested in winning this competition and reestablishing their stronghold with their own clan as in their role as rainmaker by building these big temples than they were about protecting the lifestyle and that kind of thing. So, the motivations in Montana and the corporate world, they vary, and they depend on things like whether you're on leased land or owned land. And typically, if in forestry, if you're on owned land, you might have a longer-term view and protect the environment. If you're on leased land, your incentive is to simply cut down all the trees and move to the next place. So.
And the other thing it points out, I think, at Easter Island is that not every decision about resource management is rational.
Exactly.
Like building the biggest, monument.
But they were pretty amazing monuments. I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about the book is not just, the history, but the story and the mystery. What happened to these people? How did they do these things? And from an engineer's perspective, how did they erect a 70-ton statue that's 32 feet high? And when people went there in modern times with 55-ton cranes and couldn't do it, and you wondered, how did they do it? Well, of course, that led Kurt Vonnegut to propose it was aliens that came down and did it. But I think I got some insight. I'll tell a little story. I get some insight into this from my experience on Jordan Lake. It turns out I got my water ski boat stuck summer before last when there was low water on a sandbar, and we're trying to figure out how to get this thing off the sandbar. And so the first thing we tried was the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and they came with all this modern horsepower, hundreds of horsepower pulling on this boat, nothing. Wouldn't even turn, let alone pull off the thing. And then we got turns out there were no cranes capable of doing it. And then there was a salvage company that offered to build basically the Panama Canal approach. They were going to dig a 3-foot deep trench, 50 feet long, and that would cost more than the boat.
I was going to say.
In the end, we got a bunch of friends to come and from the neighborhood and from Master Swimming, and they came out and they were wonderful. And when there were, I think 10, 12 of us, nothing. But when you have a 2,500-pound boat, and when you get up to about 18, 20, 25 people, and each person has about 100 pounds, it just slid right off. So from that, you can. This is the danger when you bring an engineer onto a book club, because you're gonna get some math and a calculation here. So from that, you can figure out how many Easter Islanders there were. So they had to be able to lift a 70-ton stone. That's 140,000 pounds, and if each person can manage about 140, it's going to take about 1,000 people to push that up with human power. So, that's probably couldn't take more than 10% of the population away to do that one task. So they probably had about 10,000 people on the island, or at least in that clan, and that's not inconsistent with the other numbers. So it's kind of interesting, the insight you get from getting stuck on Jordan Lake.
I guess so. The other thing is that you can't really paddle one of those things around, those monuments.
No,
so
no.
If you're trying to go fishing,
No.
not very useful.
No.
And it does, when you think about people employed, they're all bought into the value of this thing. They must be, because nobody's, sort of up in arms, all the fighter between these two, and among these chiefs.
Mm-hmm.
But that sort of gets into
down.
How do you believe that this thing that really you can't fish on and you can't eat it, that's going to ultimately provide security?
Yeah, so I think, the belief is that this was an important part of religion at the time, that these were, gifts to the gods, and in return for this, that the gods would provide, the gods and the rainmaker, the chieftain, would provide, through his communication with the gods, would provide water and food. And so this was this implied social contract, which worked well for hundreds of years, but broke down very abruptly. And that's one of the things that's interesting, about these stories, is the long growth and the abrupt collapse. But it's not a Malthusian collapse. I mean, this was much more subtle and intricate, and it appears, just from the way the axes and things are left around, that almost people abandoned their stone cutting tools in mid-stroke. I mean, it just almost that fast, right? So once that social contract was broken and the food wasn't there, and I think it was accelerated or amplified by the fact that as things got worse, these leaders drove towards bigger and bigger stone monuments rather than using their resources in a different way. So they actually worsened the problem at the end and accelerated the collapse.
Let's compare that collapse then to the Norse in Greenland.
Yeah, so the Norse in Greenland, there's some similarities in the sense that they came into a fragile environment. They did self-inflicted environmental damage. They were isolated. And then there was a climate change. It got cold, and they were unable to adapt, in part because of some of the choices they'd made earlier on. So in their case, some similarities. They had cut down the trees in order to plant and to use the trees for things like building houses, and also a couple of interesting things. They were dairy farmers. And so this is kind of where the engineering technology comes in. It's pretty inappropriate technology for Greenland to try to do dairy farming, because milk, produces a lot of bacteria. So after every milking, they had to sterilize the milk container by burning wood. So they were using huge amounts of wood as a result of being dairy farmers. And they were also making iron, so that they had to smelt that, and that was using huge amounts of wood. And so these were all really inappropriate technologies. And in the end, the cutting down of the trees led to the soil erosion, which led to reduced crops. And in the end, and it got colder. They got isolated from Norway and the other ships and the rest of Scandinavia, and they starved to death very abruptly. I mean, everyone died within one season. And it appears that one particularly bad spring, they didn't produce enough food. They began eating their own livestock. So they had to know at that point they weren't going to make it through the next winter. Yeah. And they didn't. So
the simple analysis is it got cold and they died.
Yeah, that was, I think, before Jared Diamond's sort of work, that's the way people viewed it. It got cold and they died. And now we realize there's a lot more to it, because there were the Inuits there at the same time. And it got cold and they didn't die. Right. So this is the interesting part of the story is, why did the Inuits survive for hundreds of years more, and in fact still survive to this day, though they're not willing to live the lifestyle anymore in modern times. But they still survive to this day, and the Vikings disappeared. And the lesson is they chose better technology in this case. So the Inuits were instead of using iron tools and dairy farming, they were using harpoons and capturing ringed seals and fishing with bone fish hooks. And one of the puzzles of the whole thing is while the Vikings were starving, the streams were full of fish.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole question of why they refuse to eat fish.
Yeah, and Diamond speculates that it may have been, it's a cultural thing, but that it may have been that Eric the Red, when first coming to settle Greenland, got a bad case of food poisoning and said, don't ever eat the fish here. And anyway, they shunned fish from there on out. And they did eat seals. And then one of the changes that occurred as they became more marginal in their survivability because of their farming is the seal population declined. There were still quite a few ring seals, but they had not developed the technology or the skill that the Inuits did to capture ring seals, which were more difficult under the ice and that kind of thing. And they weren't eating the fish. So
well, and that, I think, speaks to the concomitant effect of developing a particular technology. If you agree to fish, then you're going to develop technologies that are related to seal hunting and other maritime endeavors.
Right.
So, I mean, that seems to me a kind of insight into how humans adapt.
Well, and so it is interesting because humans are so generally adaptable that the Vikings weren't more, especially when they had a nice model in the Inuits, but they didn't copy the model, and in fact, they kind of had a bad attitude. They tended to, when they met new people, stab them and see what would happen, and would even write about that. But that didn't help them in terms of surviving, and obviously being more open-minded to different cultures would have been directly beneficial for them.
They didn't seem to have that.
Not simply enriching, but
although the story of Eric the Red, I do want to know a lot more about him. Because the number of murders that follow him.
Gosh, yeah, what a brutal society. I mean, they have just accounts of over small differences where people routinely just stabbed each other in the throat and in the back, and half dozen people at a time would be killed back and forth in a single day in this way. They were considering how few people they had in these settlements, a few dozens to a few more than 100, then it's amazing that they could tolerate that. But this brutality was an advantage over the Inuits when they first arrived because they had iron. Once they had deforested and no longer could smelt iron, then they'd lost that advantage, and so in fact they were actually in a disadvantage in terms of hostile relations with the Inuits, and that may have also led to their starvation because there were many more Inuits, and it was difficult for the Vikings to go spread out and go hunting for seals in other places other than where they were locally because they might run into the Inuits and be killed by them. So
they had already alienated.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So of
they
course,
were a bloody group.
And cultural sensitivity would have perhaps gone a long way.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to, now we're at question 3, and that is, how can we apply the gradual loss of palm trees on Easter Island as a metaphor today?
Well, the obvious metaphor is that Easter Island was so isolated, and now we live on an isolated planet traveling through space. And so, you ask yourself about the parallels between those things. And, the other parallel is, there were slow changes going on in the environment that were difficult to notice. And the most difficult to notice are changes that are slow and also masked by large fluctuations. So that brings us to climate change, and that's the obvious comparison. And we don't know to what extent carbon, which we know we've put into the atmosphere at historically maximal rates. We don't know to what extent that will change the climate. Our models aren't that good, and if it does, we don't know how we might adapt. And so, the question is whether or not carbon is the equivalent of our palm tree. Not dealing with carbon is the equivalent of cutting down the last palm tree. We just don't know. There's all kinds of interesting anecdotal examples, though. I mean, I have a colleague, dean of university in Melbourne, and was talking to him last month, and he was talking about how they had suffered through 10 years of drought, and they'd come to the conclusion that after 10 years, maybe it wasn't drought, maybe it was permanent climate change. And so they began to make changes, and they had previously consumed water at about the rate of California. And they now consume water at 1/6 that rate. They've changed to completely different crops, a different type of agriculture. They've gone to dry rice farming. It's now standard for them to collect rainwater off of every rooftop into large containers and use that for irrigation and toilets and other things. And the interesting thing about this is that they've adapted without any real diminution in their quality of life. And so it kind of gives one a sort of optimistic sense about how we might deal with, globally with significant climate change. We are an adaptable species, and we can make those changes and live. And their economy has not suffered. They've gone to different types of crops. They have to import certain foods, but they're thriving. During the economic downturn 2 years ago, they didn't do any worse than anyone else did. So I think it's an optimistic story, but at the same time, you remember that the Easter Islanders adapted too to the loss of palm trees and did quite well for a while. But what they didn't realize is they were much more vulnerable as a result of those changes, and that's hard for us to ascertain, right? So
yeah, but it does raise the question that how you frame the question is everything. If your only question is carbon the source of global warming, and is global warming a permanent condition or one of these fluctuations that we weren't around to measure a long time ago? But if you ask the question, well, what do we lose by using less carbon and using less energy? Don't we gain by using less energy and figuring out a more sustainable approach than using fossil fuels? What would you lose if you guessed wrong about carbon being the source of global warming?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So what's to lose by guessing wrong? I think we have to have, as a society, the will to pay some economic price for using energy that doesn't produce as much carbon. So that's the issue is that much of our energy comes from coal, which produces a lot of carbon, but it's incredibly cheap. I think it's 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's really difficult for any other carbon-free technology to compete with that. And so we have to decide, are we willing to pay more in order to have a carbon-free technology? When you think about our society from a Malthusian point of view, I don't think we're going to be limited by the classical Malthusian things. I mean, of exponential population growth. I think our population is growing, looks like, from 6 billion to 9 billion by 2050, which is daunting, but it's not 90 billion. It's not exponentiating. And so I think we've shown the ability as a planet to somewhat curb that exponential trend. And then in terms of consuming resources, at least for 100 years, and we have plenty of coal if we extract the energy efficiently, and we have other forms of renewable energy that could complement that. I'm high on the possibility in terms of fossil fuels. I think if fossil fuels disappeared, technology would easily adapt. I mean, I'm high on electric vehicles. Even with present technology, electric vehicles could meet 80% of our need. Tom Friedman talks about the fact that once you get to an economy of scale, from a mechanical engineer's point of view, those are simple vehicles. They're less expensive to build than combustion engines. So, and that's without any technology improvement. And I'm really excited about some of the things I see even in the Pratt School of Engineering on wireless charging and things that would make electric vehicles much easier to use, where you just pull into your garage and automatically it charges. You don't have to plug it in. And it would take it from being a disadvantage to have electric to being never stop at a gas station again. So I think the limits we're going to run up against are not population and they're not resources. It's going to be environmental damage. That's the part that's less clear. And I take Nate Lewis's view on this, which is the chemist at Caltech, who says that we're about to do a global experiment on an unprecedented scale. I'd just rather not, right? We don't really know what's going to happen, but you have to really feel lucky to want to take that kind of an experiment on. So what would be the price of going low carbon? It would be, we would pay more for energy, right? So
in the short run, but ultimately the sun and wind are free and even cheaper than coal. It's just the technology to get us there. So there's this hump that we have to get over.
That's the Tom Friedman argument, right? That it's say 2 cents a kilowatt hour for coal, and if you did carbon capture on the coal, it costs about maybe 10 cents a kilowatt hour, something like that. And now at that point, so if you really put a carbon tax on, said either capture the carbon or you're going to be taxed 8 cents a kilowatt hour for the carbon you produce, then other forms of energy like solar and wind become cost competitive or cost advantageous, and we can move to some of those things, and even the carbon capture coal we could move to. So there's there's all kinds of possibilities at that point. But what that's going to do is drive up the cost of what you pay for energy initially. So we saw the $4 a gallon gasoline and how that how society responded, good and bad. So the good news, the bad news, it was a terrible hardship on people, and on the individual, and their family and their budget. And yet it caused a change in behavior that was terribly good. We saw people no longer living so far away, moving into closer to their work, using less energy. We saw people going to mass transit. And there's actually a noticeable bend in the curve in terms of carbon production as a result of that economic downturn. So we were actually doing something good for the planet, but feeling the pain in the individual family.
And then we felt the pain right in the pocketbook. The price of gasoline was the thing that spurred more development and more conservation. But getting back to the Papua New Guinea example, because you talk about the price of coal being cheap, that's because the social costs aren't factored in. So if that was on the ledger and on the prospectus, it would turn out to be a less good investment.
Right.
Those social costs were felt by the people of Papua New Guinea. In other words, when the trees came down, the crops didn't work as well. They made the connection between the way the root system was acting as antibiotic and some of the other factors, and insecticide too, I think. So they went to the extra expense, right, the extra labor of actually developing a Celia culture, right? Their silviculture, right? That cost them. That had to. They spent more time now nurturing trees than husbanding their crops.
Yep.
But they felt it immediately. So, in other words, the social cost of losing trees was immediately noticeable to everybody in the community.
Right.
And we don't really feel the social cost of the health cost of suspended particulates and what that means to lost time and hospital visits. And all
Again,
that.
it's the difference is this sort of slow effect that was covered by fluctuations. It's kind of hard to notice that leads to that creeping normalcy. So, if you could feel it right away, then that could lead to change in behavior and motivation for society. So the question is, how can we learn from what the people in Papua New Guinea did?
Well, and Diamond, he does. He considers some examples of successful. This is question 4. We might as well move on. He does consider some examples of successful societal adaptation and survival. So let's talk about what we find.
I think the ones that struck me the most, besides the one in Japan that I mentioned where they recognized the deforestation and stopped it, and the remarkable thing about that is that Japan to this day is the most forested developed country in the world. So it really had a long-term effect. But the other one that's really striking is in Hispaniola, so Dominican Republic and on one side, Haiti on the other. And you see the effect of choosing to succeed or fail, because geophysically, the two sides are identical. There's no difference in climate or disadvantage in either case. But if you look on Google Earth, and I encourage everybody to kind of go home and do this, go Google Earth Haiti and take a look and see if you can find the border without any other information. And you can find it, because from a satellite view, you can see completely barren countryside in Haiti and then a rich forest on the Dominican Republic side. And the difference is the decision made to protect the trees, by the leadership in Dominican Republic, and then the failure to do that in Haiti, which led to complete erosion of the soil and inability of the people to feed themselves, and just the dire and the poorest country in the world as a result.
We have a question too. Eric is asking a question about whether would the conclusion in Diamond's book suggest that Haiti was pretty much doomed before the earthquake and is surely doomed now, or can Haiti be saved?
That's a great question. So, what does the book? What are the stories in Diamond's book say about Haiti? Well, most of the societies that Diamond studies in the book are isolated, right? And Haiti is not. So there is the possibility Haiti can get help from the rest of the world, and does. But there's still the overriding message that the society and the leaders have to make the decisions to protect the environment, to build the infrastructure. And from friends I have at Duke who go every year and volunteer their time in Haiti, they're not seeing that movement yet. So I think the answer to the listener is that they're not doomed, but at the same time they haven't shown yet any encouraging signs that they will come out of it.
Right, and the other thing is, so when you make these decisions, and we assume that they're somewhat rational, I mean, even if they appear to us to be irrational, if your religion dictates that a big statue will promise rain,
Yes,
that's a rational
it's
choice
rational.
to build those
Yep.
things. So then the question becomes, who are the winners, who are the losers, and what's the decision-making process? And I think that's something else that's pretty clear from this book, although it's harder to know how ancient societies were governed. It's pretty clear that choices are made based on who wins, who loses, and who's in charge.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, and that's everything, right? So it's the leadership. So that's the I think the encouraging message of the book, and at the same time the frightening one, which is that the decisions that political leadership make the difference between life and death, survival and collapse. So that's encouraging that we actually have control, but at the same time a little bit frightening that so much of our future is in the hands of political leaders, and their motivations vary so greatly.
And again, the winners. I mean, I think the examples early in the book in Montana look at competing interests and what it is that you have to gain, how you see that land. If that's the place that you go because you love to see the big sky,
right,
then you want that preserved. But if you make a living off of that land, then you might have to haze up the sunshine once in a while.
I mean, you see these different motivations in all walks of life and fields. I mean, the Rothschild winery has long been known that has been managed with an overarching goal of the survival of the name, and the vintner, the vineyard for posterity. And so it's not motivated by profit. The goal of the leadership has been, for centuries now, to ensure that the vineyard survives. And so that's a very different motive than the typical U.S. CEO. So that changes. Like you said, the choices in Montana are very different choices depending on what's motivating. The Easter Islander chieftains, they were motivated by winning in their competition with the fellow clans, and they cared about that more than surviving.
So the question it raises, I guess, in a complex society, in a complex economy like ours, where we're not really living a sustainable existence. It's not by that I mean we're not living hand to mouth. With a complex economy, what does it mean to make a rational choice about resource use when what's rational for me is painful for you?
Well, that's a great question, and we have one of the world's experts here at Duke, and Dan Ariely, on rational choices, and I heard him on NPR, and I don't know if it was your show or not recently, and essentially a version of that question was asked, is that how can we use the decision-making process of the individual, what we've learned about decision-making process in individuals, and apply it collectively to societies, right? In other words, we've learned on how to modify our behavior to either make rational decisions or to make even irrational decisions that are to our benefit. But we haven't learned how to translate that to the groupthink level. And that's really the frontier, I think.
There's a question here at not the political level, but the engineering level.
Yeah.
Melanie is asking a question about the Pratt School itself. How can tackling the grand challenges of engineering, as Pratt students are now doing, help our society avoid collapse, similar to those detailed in the book?
Yeah. So one of the reasons that I was interested in this book is because as an engineer and as an educator of future engineers, I'm very interested in the role that technology can play in preventing collapse. And so this issue has come up from the National Academy of Engineering as well. They've identified 14 grand challenges for the 21st century, and they span the general topics of sustainability, health, security, and joy. And at least with regard to the first one, sustainability, the book has a lot of insight to give about that. So one of the things that we've been trying to do at Pratt is to prepare students to be able to address the grand challenges over the course of their careers. And these are challenges that involve engineering, but they're complex societal technical problems that are systems level problems. So engineering or technology alone is not enough. So we've established a program at Pratt called the Grand Challenge Scholars, which I'm proud to say now is at about 35 top engineering universities across the country now. And it gives to the students a grounding in engineering fundamentals plus 5 other things, and those are policy, because we've talked about how important that is, business, business and entrepreneurship, international perspectives, social consciousness development, and hands-on experience with or project on a grand challenge. And the hope is that we'll grow this to about 30 to 50 graduates a year from Duke, plus a similar number from top 50 or 100 universities across the country. So we'll be producing a couple of thousand graduates a year who are uniquely prepared and motivated to tackle these kinds of grand challenges. And so, this is kind of our response to, leadership and policy are just so important. It's too important to leave it to just the politicians. We really need to prepare a generation of students that is, has the skill set and mindset to tackle these things.
But that sounds like a very different model for an engineering school. It also sounds like you might have to have very different students in some ways.
Well, we do have different students. The motivations of students, is kind of documented, has changed from my generation, where most of the people of my age were drawn into engineering because they liked math and puzzle solving. And that's still a great reason to do engineering. It's a really fun career path. But the motivations of this generation of students, much more, they want to have an impact, and they want to help people, they want to change the world. And so that fits really well with this type of education. And it also fits with where the profession of engineering is going. If you look at the great achievements of the 20th century, they were mostly devices. They were lasers and cars and space travel and the computer chip. These are all devices. And the 21st century grand challenges are provide clean water, reverse engineer the brain, make solar energy economical, achieve nuclear fusion. For the most part, these are not devices at all. And so they require this broader set of skills. And that is a great thing for a place like Duke, because we have, such richness here. We have strengths in business and law and policy and liberal arts, even in the humanities, to understand the cultural perspective. So,
right.
So it is a great place to I think, lead the change in the engineering education and engineering profession.
Well, another interesting part of that whole problem and solution, which is kind of a cross-disciplinary approach, is the fact that these problems are now global. I mean, in most of the examples here were isolated communities in Rosenthal, and they didn't know.
Yeah.
Does that help, or does that hurt, in a way? The fact that everything we do now is part of the whole world and not just Durham.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because in some ways we are, again, an island, but on a bigger scale. And so one of the things that these societies had in common is almost all of them were on a fairly fragile, in a fairly fragile environment. Only the narrow fjords in the Greenland could support life and things like that. So we have a bigger landscape. So we're not as fragile. We're more robust. But at the same time, the pressure we're putting on the planet with 9 billion people is at a different scale as well. So the answer is complex. I don't know that they're two competing pieces to the answer. We're better off in some ways, and we're greater risk in others. So,
well, one of the things I think that Diamond points to is one of the benefits is that you've got at least more minds around the world working on pretty much the same problems.
That's certainly true.
But of course, the other side is we've got these lines drawn from a bygone age when an idea of a nation with its boundaries at the mountain or the stream made sense. But now that we see ourselves really as all sharing the same resources and the same air.
Well, so there's all kinds of interesting aspects to that, because we're all sharing the same resources and air, and you see already an aspect of tragedy to the commons to that, right? So we're sharing the same air, but if you're a country like China and you're trying to drive your economic growth, it's to your advantage to go ahead and pollute a little bit more, because that's to your narrow advantage, even though it kind of costs everybody else. And if everybody took that attitude, obviously we would have the tragedy of the commons repeated at the global scale, rather than overgrazing sheep. You mentioned that we have all these minds to now apply to the problem, and that's a great advantage. So I think that's where science comes in. And at the beginning of the interview, we were talking about the Easter Islanders didn't really appreciate the impact that cutting down the trees had on the soil erosion and those kinds of things. We at least have the benefit of the sciences. We need to keep investing in that so that we understand so we do, the effect of carbon on climate. We need better climate models, so we need to keep investing in that. That'll be a key piece of being able to choose to survive.
And it also presents the possibility of a blending of this top-down, bottom-up approach, because as more of us become aware, I mean, even in an authoritarian state like China, where the political price for pollution is a little smaller, and they can even control the internet, ultimately people are going to get wise to what's happening to them and demand change.
I love that point. Yeah, there's a potential now for a combination of a top-down and bottom-up approach. Remember, what was needed for the bottom-up approach was a clear understanding from everybody. So through the information age, the ability to do mass communication and mass education, it does offer that possibility. And we see some evidence of that. There are signs of hope, so that we see sort of bottom-up behavior, like investment even in green technology funds, and that's both in investing in green technology that's like renewable energy and things like that, but also investing in green companies that are not doing anything to do with energy technology and that kind of thing, but who use green practices. And those things are becoming more popular. That's very ground up. You mentioned conservation. There's some ground up options that are very exciting, because top down is not looking good right now. Top down, carbon cap and trade is pretty much dead. I mean, Obama admitted that the political climate is that top down is not going to happen. But bottom up, there's some interesting things. There's a French company, there's an interesting anecdote, that has figured out how to make money from conservation. And that has eluded everyone up until now, because basically if you were a utility provider, you really didn't, out of the goodness of your heart, you might promote conservation, but it really wasn't a business model for making money. So what they've come up with is it's a provider that provides TV cable service, right? So they do cable, internet, telephone, and energy conservation. And so what this is monitoring devices. They come in and they keep track of your behavior. They have some intelligence with them, and they adjust automatically for you. Your heating, possibly they might even turn on and off your refrigerator to take advantage of times of the day where energy might be cheaper in the future and things like that. And they guarantee for you that they will save you something like $600 a year, and you pay them $200 for the service. So everybody wins.
Yeah, well, and while we were fighting tooth and nail the Kyoto Accords and whether or not to sign those, the Germans were racing ahead to build the technology and the devices that were going to bring down those carbon emissions.
Right.
They are now in the vanguard of green technology, making hundreds of billions of dollars a year in the very technology that we eschewed because we wanted to keep the oil industry going.
Right.
And this is precisely the kind of choices, I think, that, the oil industry is an industry. It provides jobs. It's important, but which is going to be more important in the future? And do we understand the choice before us?
Right.
That's a key question. So let's move on now. This last question. Many people believe we don't have to worry about overconsumption. Burn all the oil and coal you want. It's just fine because technology is going to come up with a way that's going to save us from whatever shortage or harsh environmental conditions we'll face. Anything to learn from this book about that approach to our impending problems?
Yeah, we've talked about it a little bit, but the lesson from this book is that technologies do play a key role in whether societies survive or collapse, and the example is the inappropriate technologies chosen by the Greenland Vikings compared to the appropriate technologies chosen by the Inuits, and clearly dairy farming, burning wood, and making iron, and even further to use. They used sod for thermal insulation, and it just further, depleted the topsoil, which was so slow to replenish and so fragile in that economy. It was just really poor technology choices. And had they adopted and been willing to adopt the different technology, you draw the analogies to what you just said. They're all, we can use petroleum, but we can use these other choices. And what's preventing us from doing that? What was preventing the Greenlanders from adopting these technologies which were available to them? And
you get the feeling that what they were saying is, we're Norse, we're dairy farmers, darn it, that's what we do, don't matter where we are.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, it's a cultural attitude, and that they benefited from that for centuries, in fairness. Right. They had developed a culture of taking very little risk and making very little change because they'd found a way to survive in a harsh environment. And most of the time when you experimented with other ways of surviving in that environment, it was disastrous. So over time, they had been conditioned to this cultural behavior. So there was a sense of identity and a sense of experience that made them averse to adopting the new technology they needed to adopt.
I think that's an excellent point, and one that you have to make, that Jared Diamond is very good at contextualizing and synthesizing the story and conclusions from stories that are well known. That's societies that have survived for hundreds of years. But let's talk about those people who are too quick to adapt, and we don't know about, because within 3 generations they died out. There's no evidence of them, and frankly, their their swiftness, their fleetness was the thing that did them in. So, in fairness, conservative societies that say we dairy farm, darn it, there's something to that, and it kept them going for those many years. Yeah,
that's true. There are no stories in the book like that because those tended not to leave lasting footprints to be studied, right?
Let's talk a little bit about the one of the more perplexing and interesting items in the book, and that is about population control. Those societies that managed to control their population, because if you did the math, they'd have had hundreds of millions of people on their little island. So it's possible. Human societies have figured it out, and yet the methods and the means were not appealing, I have to say. Some of them.
Well, I'm not sure which ones you're referring to, but the one that comes to mind is the Mayan culture, right? Because they had reached, they actually were the closest to a Malthusian type of expansion and collapse. They were in central Piton. They had reached populations of 10 million. So you can imagine they basically had cities that were Los Angeles sized. This is amazing, and lasting for hundreds of years, and then collapsing to 30,000 people. So you imagine Los Angeles suddenly populated by just the size of Chapel Hill, and it's what happened to those people. And part of it was the overpopulation expansion. They were limited. They were water limited, and but they managed to find ways to build cenotes that could provide water for 10,000 people for 18 months, and the pretty impressive technology that would, and this is in porous limestone, they had to encase and various things to get it to hold the water. And that allowed them to grow the population right to the limit of what the land could support. And then when climate change came, and there were basically droughts in various parts, they were covering the whole Yucatan, so the droughts came, and in prior years, prior eras, they were able to move and populate other areas. But by the time they reached their peak, they had filled everything. So the land was supporting the maximum it could, and then when a series of droughts occurred, not just one, but and scattered around the Yucatan, it kind of gradually decimated the whole culture.
I was thinking, and I can't think of the name of the island, but there was an island culture that somehow managed to maintain a kind of zero population growth, but that was owing to infanticide. I mean, there were birth control methods, both chemical contraception and abortion, but infanticide and then suicides, where people would just sort of take off in a canoe, realizing that their choice was starve to death or not. And this was usually in times of crisis.
These are dire measures, right. And I think we're a little more optimistic today. Again, it's a combination of knowledge, sort of being aware of what the resources can support, and the Chinese example of top-down, limiting of one child per family, does have an amazingly profound effect.
So, are you optimistic? How do you feel about our future?
Well, you're asking an engineer. So the engineer's view of optimism, pessimism is, the optimist says that the glass is half full, and the pessimist says that the glass is half empty, and the engineer says the glass is 100% over spec. So, my feeling is that, I'm positive about the fact that the message from this book is that, there's no sort of environmental determinism here. There really are decisions we can make that coupled with a little bit of serendipity, make a difference in our ability to survive. And I'm somewhat optimistic about this generation of students and the preparation we're giving them, and not just the Grand Challenge Scholars, but which is in the engineering school, but things that are going on in business, in the business school and the School of Environment. We have a corporate sustainability initiative at Duke, which involves students from both those schools plus the engineering school, and you know, the kind of preparing and arming a generation of students and citizens who, you know, have the tools to make the right decisions for us.
So we have the intellectual and creative wherewithal. We're making adjustments in the academy to try to reconfigure how an engineer is made.
Yep.
But it seems to me that there are three alternatives that we hear about most frequently. One is we're all doomed. We're never going to make it off this planet alive. Cockroaches have been here longer than us, and they're going to. The second is, oh, fine, we'll make it. Technology will save us. There's a third scenario, and that is that we will be saved, but it will take, but not before the calamity. That something calamitous will happen, and the remnant then will wise up and figure out a way around this. Where are you in that? See, I didn't give you the binary. I gave you a third option.
Yeah, well, that's a good one. Yeah, you know, I can't tell you. I think that the first two are just false. I mean, I think that one can't say that we're doomed. You know, there's lots of examples here where you can make the right decision, and we've talked about the limits to growth going back to the 70s, right? We've talked about the limits to growth and how we know to overcome them. We know how to control population. We know, and we've shown that we can do that. And we've talked a little bit about resources, and we will be somewhat resource limited, but for example, energy is not going to be the limitation. So it really comes down to environment, I think, and the issue is, you know, can we develop the knowledge base fast enough that we need in order to be able to realize what's happening to us, and then can we act on that, and you know, in enough time, you know. So you know, technology. You know, as an engineer, I have great faith in the ability of technology to increase the productivity of agriculture and do all kinds of things and mitigate the effects of climate change. But there's a time element,
right?
And you just don't know.
I mean, we do have to move to those new technologies before there's a cataclysmic fight over the remaining resources. If we say stick with fossil fuel and don't make the adjustment to renewables quick enough, then we start fighting over the last couple of lumps of coal, right?
Well,
that could be a bad fight.
Well, you know, coal is so abundant and so cheap. We have a long time on that. I mean, I don't know what the current estimate is, but it's in the hundreds of years. And fossil fuels, not so much. But like I said, I'm not so concerned about that, because if fossil fuels were, you know, if gas were $6 a gallon tomorrow, we'd be making electric vehicles like crazy. You know, so we would I think make a relatively seamless transition. I don't know if that's the case 3 scenario. It would have some pain associated with it, but it certainly wouldn't be collapse or catastrophic, I don't think.
Well, we're counting on those Duke students to make all that happen.
Right.
Tom,
Thanks,
great
Frank.
to talk with you.
Yeah.
Tom Katsouleas is the Dean of the Engineering School, the Pratt School here at Duke. And thank you all for your questions. I want to remind you that next Duke Reads will be January 2011. Where has this millennium gone? It's really kind of whizzed by. The exact dates and time for the spring semester Duke Reads session are going to be posted before the end of this year at the website, so pay attention to that. Office hours. Office hours. This Friday, November 19th at noon, will feature Ibrahim Musa. He is the director of the Center for the Study of Muslim Networks and associate professor of Islamic Studies at Duke. He's going to talk about contemporary conflicts involving Sharia law, so please tune into that. And if you want to listen to this session again, you go to Duke On Demand in a day or so, and it will be there. Happy New Year and happy Thanksgiving.